you guys right now. So to get started, we're going to talk about a sourdough starter. It's also known as levain, I believe is how you pronounce it, and it's like the leavening substitute to baking soda or baking powder, and it utilizes 3 ingredients: flour, water, and yeast. And if you have yeast, this will make the process a little bit easier for you because your sourdough starter will ferment and cultivate all of that bubbly goodness in about 3 to 7 days, depending on the temperature, the weather outside, your feeding schedule, and just because they like to be temperamental. It is a living thing, so you do have to feed it every day in the beginning, and then that slows down after that beginning starter period. So I'll bring out the star of the show. This is my sourdough starter. My kids have named him Harry, and we've had him for maybe a couple weeks now. The longest sourdough starter I've had was alive for 5 years, and I baked everything with it, and it just produced the most delicious stuff because the flavor had just been building and building for a long time. So I guess before I go into how to make the sourdough starter, just to allow more people to join, I'll talk about the science behind it and why it's beneficial for you. It's good to eat versus, commercial or store-bought bread. And sourdough starter's only made with 3 ingredients, and that's flour, water, and yeast. And you can add sugar. Sometimes that speeds up the process. A lot of times it will make your sourdough starter kind of angry and want to eat a lot, but like I said, they can be kind of temperamental. So yeast. Yeast is something you can buy 2 ways in the store. Right now it's kind of hard to find, but usually it's the item that nobody ever buys, and it can sit on store shelves forever. And it comes as instant yeast and active dry yeast. And the only difference between those two is how quickly it will react when you put it in with flour, sugar, or water. I use instant yeast just because it will cultivate really fast. And sometimes I'm a lazy baker and I don't like to let stuff proof, or I don't like to let my sourdough starter get active before I want to bake with it. And so I use instant yeast because it's like really quick reaction, and you can see bubbles and, goodness starting as soon as it hits that water and you mix it with flour. Active dry yeast is also good. You just have to wake it up a little bit, and to wake up yeast that you've had in your cupboard for a while is an easy thing to do. You just put it in a cup of water that is warmed to about 90 to 100 degrees. If you don't have a thermometer, you can run some water over your hand, and if it's warm and comfortable, that's about right for putting your yeast in. You let it sit for about 5 minutes. You'll see bubbles starting. That means that your yeast is awake and alive and ready to use. Now, if you don't have yeast to start your sourdough starter, that's okay. What you can do is grab some fruit, fresh fruit. The best results I've had come from raisins or grapes. Apples work great, plums, apricot, any kind of stone fruit works really good. And the reason for this is if you have like an apricot or a plum, you'll notice that the skin will get kind of powdery, and that white powder substance is actually yeast that's kind of trying to make your fruit ferment. And if you peel off those skins and soak them in some warm water over 1 or 2 or 3 days, you'll notice that your water will start to cultivate like a fermented substance that you can add to the flour with water, take the skins out, and that will start to cultivate a sourdough starter for you. So if you were not able to find yeast in the store, take your fruit. If it's not waxed, like apples are great, I would just try to brush off a lot of that wax, because a lot of produce will get sprayed with wax before you buy it in the store. It's so thin you can't really tell that it's on there, but it does have it. So scrub that off, let it sit on your counter and get kind of yucky looking, not moldy or anything, but just to where you notice a little bit of a film powdery growing on it, and that's yeast, and you can use that to harvest yeast for your starter. and you'll filter out those skins, use that water with flour in your vessel, and then you'll start your sourdough starter. So for me, since I have yeast, I added 2 cups of flour, 2 cups of water, and about a tablespoon of yeast. And I let that sit for about 3 to 5 days. And in the time that it's sitting, every day, you will have to discard and add. Those are terms that you'll kind of hear, well, as I'm explaining how to use your sourdough starter later on. But discard from your sourdough starter is really important because that's what you're going to use to bake with. And every time you feed your starter, you will have to discard half of it. Now, in the beginning of your cultivation of your sourdough starter, you won't want to use that discard because it's not really up to where you want it to be. You can use it, but you won't get a great rise from it. It'll just be like flour, really. It'll have a little bit of yeast, but it won't have that sour flavor that you're trying to get. So it seems a little wasteful in the beginning. If you do want to use it, you can. It'll just give your stuff a little bit more oomph. Your bread probably won't come out great, but you can use it for supplemental leavening for like pancakes or cookies or any kind of batter that you're making, muffins, cupcakes. You can throw that in there with your regular batter. So after you add that flour, water, and yeast, you're going to stir it up. Make sure your water is warm, like I explained before, about 90 to 100 degrees. And then you'll put it into a container that is double the size of what you have inside. So before things start getting bubbly, you want to make sure you have at least double the size, because I just fed this guy, I guess, a couple of days ago, and he was like down here, and he grows slowly because I keep him in my fridge. But you'll see it rise almost to the top of your container. Sometimes it will overflow if people choose a really small container. You can use any container that is not metal. You can use a Tupperware, you can use a Ziploc bag, anything that's not metal, because the metal will interact with the good bacteria and the chemical reaction that's going on with the yeast inside. And that goes for the utensils you're going to use to stir it with. You don't want to use any metal. Just try not to introduce any metal into the good stuff that's going on inside your container. Let's see. Once everything mixes up, you will put a hat on it, as my kids say, and we use a coffee filter because it will leave the capability for air to pass in between, but it also keeps things like bugs or just random Legos and things from flying into it. You can put a tea towel or a dish towel over it, anything that will allow air to pass through, but also keep, other unwanted stuff out. And then after you mix everything up that first day and put a cover over it, leave it in a warm place, just like you would put bread to proof, any kind of thing that you want to keep warm. It is living. Cold will slow down the process, so warmth will help it be a little bit happier, and you'll get a better reaction for that yeast to cultivate and grow. I keep mine close to my microwave. Sometimes I put it on top of my microwave because I'm using my microwave like nonstop with my kids, and it will keep that area nice and warm. And the next day, about the same time that you mixed it up, you're gonna take it open, take the hat off, pull out half or roughly half, doesn't have to be exactly, of your starter and discard it. Like I said before, you can save it, you can use it, or you can just throw it away. Whatever you discard, you want to put the equal amount back in, and that's to feed your yeast. So I pull out, mine is roughly 2.5 to 2 cups. I pull out about a cup. That's what I use to bake with. Anytime I make bread or pancakes, I take about a cup or so out of there, and then I'll put a cup of flour and a cup of water back in. If you're keeping your starter out of the fridge for those first couple of days, you have to feed it every day. I would say after you get it to the point where you think the sour smell, it's pretty pungent, it's very yeasty smelling, it's very bready smelling, After that couple of days that you're cultivating your starter, you'll start to smell it, and it will smell like someone's baking bread. My kids will always say, "Are you baking bread?" And I'm like, "No, I just fed the starter." Um, but once it gets to a nice sour smell, not a bad smell, but good smell, you can put it in your fridge, and you only have to feed it about once a week or every time you bake. We bake about a loaf of bread a week, so I feed it about once a week. And this is where I start to bring up the sciencey stuff, because when people get problems with their starter, it usually has to do with some weird science behind it. But to break down what's going on in your starter, um, the yeast is eating the glucose or the gluten in your flour. So yeast likes to eat sugar. It will eat that gluten in your flour, and its byproduct will be two things: CO2 and alcohol. The CO2 is what we're getting when we see the bubbles. That's the gas being trapped in the dough, and it gives your bread a really nice crumb, which is the holes that you see inside your bread. So the more sour, the more fermented your starter, the better crumb you're going to get, the better holes, the better breadiness you're going to get, and a lot of people like that. The more alcohol you get, which brings me to showing you my starter. I don't know if you can see it really well right now because I just mixed it, but some of you will get like a thin layer of liquid. It's usually peach colored, off colored. It should never be green. It should never be gross smelling. If it gets to that point, it means that mold has formed in your starter. Throw it out and start over again. But if you stay on top of your schedule with feeding your starter, the liquid you get will be pretty pleasant. It smells kind of like bread, and it's what gives your bread that sour flavor. It's alcohol. Most of us call it hooch. It's what people make when they ferment, fruit and stuff, and that's how beer is made usually, or vodka from potatoes. So that's the alcohol content. It's not pleasant. I wouldn't recommend drinking it. Some people pour it off of their starter. They don't really like that sourness, so they'll pour it out and add water to substitute in place of it. I just mix mine back in because I really like that sour flavor, and it's not going to hurt you. That will get baked off and evaporate whenever you make something. So if you like the hooch, leave it in, mix it in. If you don't like it, pour it out and add water. But if you see a lot of that liquid forming, it means that you're not feeding your starter enough. So some people will forget to feed it one day, and they'll notice kind of like a thin layer, maybe about a half inch to an inch on top or in the middle of their starter. And it means your starter is pretty angry. He's throwing out a lot of alcohol because he's starved. He's trying to eat as much gluten as he can. You need to get back on schedule to feeding it, or it's a signal that you can start slowing down the feeding of your starter and keep it in the fridge. You just kind of have to train it to get there. In the beginning of my starter, before I put it in the fridge, I was starting to see more of that hooch form. My starter was pretty angry. He wanted to eat like twice a day. So I told him to chill out. I put him in the fridge, and now I only feed him once a week. But that's about it for, I guess, the science behind the starter. I kind of talked a little bit about the yeast eating the gluten. And so a lot of people who have gluten sensitivity will use sourdough starter to bake bread. And they notice that they don't get a lot of upset stomach. And I think a lot of it has to do with something called phytic acid, which happens when we eat grains or bread that our body can't digest. Sourdough starter is a really good thing because the yeast will eat up that phytic acid, and you won't really get an upset stomach like you usually do. Some people still have a sensitivity to it, but sourdough starter is a really good way to introduce bread into your diet if you have had problems with that in the past. It's also a really good way to introduce fermented foods into your body, which a lot of people say is good for GI health. And a lot of it has to do with the yeast eating up all that bad stuff that's normally in bread that gives us upset stomach. Sourdough starter and sourdough bread has a really high content of it versus regularly baked bread or commercially baked bread. So I think that's about it as far as the health benefits of sourdough starter and sourdough bread. If you are muted right now and you have any questions about what I just went over, please feel free to ask, or I can repeat anything. I know I kind of blew through everything really fast, but if anybody has any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask. Everybody good?
Do you have to have it at room temperature out of the refrigerator when you feed it? Or it can be right from the refrigerator?
It can be right from the refrigerator. Before I bake, I like to feed it because I notice that I get the best lift in my breads or any other kind of baked good if my starter is fed. And so what I'll do is sometimes I'll just pull it out of my fridge and let it warm up for about 15 minutes until it's, you know, kind of more awake and alive. And then I'll feed it, and then I'll discard an even greater amount. So after it's fed, it will usually get happier and more active, and that's the reaction that you want to get a greater lift for your bread or whatever you're baking. So it just depends on what you're looking for. I have used it straight cold from my fridge in my bread machine, and my bread machine does a really good job of keeping everything warm in the kneading process, and that will do the job alone. So it's kind of trial and error. It's usually what you experience if you pull it straight out of the fridge and bake something. You'll say, well, you know, my bread doesn't have a lot of great crumb. The holes are not very big. It's more dense. Maybe next time I'll let it heat up before I bake with it, or maybe I'll feed it before I bake with it. We don't really have a problem with, you know, the holes in our bread not being big enough, because I usually make it to bake like sandwich bread. I'm not really making a lot of like artisanal bread. I rarely make bread where I'm doing the kneading process and the fermenting process to bake in my oven. And that's a fun thing to do, but it takes a lot longer because unless you have a stand mixer, you will have to be pulling and kneading that bread for, you know, several processes. You'll have to set it out for several hours to proof. And I noticed that that's when it doesn't really matter if you, or that's when it does matter that the yeast or the starter is warm, because you want those bigger bubbles in your bread. I think I saw a question in the chat. Bobby, if you can read it for me. I don't know if I can pull it up.
Candace said, how many days do you normally need to wait, and how many times a day should you feed it?
So how many days to wait for your starter to cultivate before you can start baking with your discard usually varies. If you're using commercial yeast in your starter from day one, you can usually start baking with your discard after about 3 to 5 days. I think I had mine out on the counter for 5 days with the commercial starter, with the commercial yeast, before I started getting that great sour smell, before the bubble action was really there. If you are cultivating your own yeast, you might get a strong reaction that quick. I do notice it takes a little bit longer, anywhere from like 7 to 10 days, just because you need to catch and harvest that wild yeast that's, you know, just active in the air, or that's on your fruit. So that's another thing I didn't say in the beginning, is that you don't really need fruit to start cultivating yeast. It is in the air all the time. These bacteria, the lactobacilli, which is naturally in your starter, in the air, and the yeast that you're catching, wild yeast in the air that's coming from outside or just on your skin, on your fruit, on your food, it is all the time around you. And so you can catch it in your flour and water mixture alone. And you'll just add that 1 or 2 cups of flour, the equal amount of water, warm water, and set it on your countertop. It might take a little bit longer. You might need to have it in a warmer spot, but you will see bubbles forming after about 7 to 10 days. And it's kind of a fun thing for kids to do, because you're really getting something from nothing or something from nowhere. It's like invisible yeast. But it can be done that way too. It's just a little bit more trial and error. Sometimes you don't always get it on the first try, and you will have to feed it twice as much. I've noticed in the past when I've done it that way, I feed it twice a day, versus with my instant yeast, I only feed it once a day. Or if you have, you know, fruit skins or raisins, you'll only really have to feed it once a day. I think I saw another question pop up. right now.
Chloe said, can you go over the feeding process and schedule again once it is established?
Once it's established, sure. So once you notice your, well, for feeding your starter from the beginning, you're going to be discarding at least once a day and adding once a day. And that's the equal amount. So if you start with 2 cups of flour, 2 cups of water, and you discard half of that, which is 1 cup, you'll want to add 1 cup of flour, 1 cup of water. And that's every day while you're cultivating your starter. Once it gets to the point that you like the sourness or the smell, once you try to bake with your discard and you say, hey, this came out great, I kind of like the point that it's at, you can store it in your fridge. I store mine in my fridge. It's been about 3 weeks old, and I only feed it about once a week. Sometimes I feed it every other day if I use some for cake batter, but I noticed that it's okay with that. It's kind of adapts to, you know, my schedule, as long as I add, you know, that flour and water, the same amount that I took out from the discard. Somebody added something to the chat there.
Can you read it? It's from Jackie. It says, when you feed it, do you need to make sure all the lumps are out? Do you mix the flour and water together before you add it to feed?
Yeah, good question. So every time I pull it out of the fridge, I will have like a layer. I don't know if you can see inside. I will have a layer of liquid at the top, not a lot. It's usually about 1/8 of an inch or like little pockets of liquid. It's mostly bubbly. But every time I pull it out, I'll see a little bit of liquid cultivating, and I'll take my plastic spoon and mix it up quickly. At this point, if you don't like to keep that hooch on there, you can dump it out and add a little bit of water to replace it. Just depends on how you like the flavor of your bread. I think that leaving it in there gives it a really great flavor. And so I just mix it in quickly before I add. You know, if I took out my discard, I'll mix it before I take out my discard, and then I'll add in the flour and water to make it up. And then I'll mix it pretty good. If you have pockets of flour that aren't mixed, I think you'll notice in the end that the yeast will kind of work its way in there, and it will get hydrated, and it will get kind of cultivated in there. Sometimes I have pulled it out where I have like a little bit of flour that's not mixed in. I don't know how well you guys can see that. And that's okay too. You know, you'll be, as often as you'll be feeding it or mixing it, it will get incorporated later on. You don't really have to make it perfectly mixed. Just as long as you kind of mix in all that flour and water, you'll be fine. Any other questions? Anybody have any spots?
Is there a specific website or book that you go to figure out recipes for baking bread? Like you said, cakes, muffins, and whatnot, to get the ratios right?
Yeah, is that Tracy? I think they were gonna. Yeah, so Bobby posted in the chat my Pinterest board for my tried and true recipes, and also for some tips about your sourdough starter. I always refer to King Arthur Flour website. They also have a hotline, kind of like Butterball does with the turkey, where if your bread is not working out, you don't really know what to do, you can call King Arthur Flour, and they make some really great flour, bread flour, all-purpose flour, but they are kind of like the tried and true bread source. And all of their recipes have been tested exhaustingly. Like, people have tried to sort out, oh my gosh, I put in only half of the, you know, they really go through every kind of troubleshooting scenario. And they also have a lot of tips about sourdough starters. And you'll start to see, if you go on Pinterest, there are a lot of ways to start a sourdough starter. My way is not the only way. If this way didn't work out for you, please try the other ways that you see on there, because it might just depend, you know, on what comes alive for you. I have tried it about 3 or 4 different ways. This way is different than the way I've done before. I added a little bit of sugar on the first day to try to get my yeast to wake up a little bit, because this instant yeast I've had is about 1 year old. I didn't know how alive it would be, but I wanted to give it food, and yeast loves sugar product. You know, it will just eat it up completely. So there are a lot of different ways to start it. You'll find some really fancy ways that like pro bakers do it, and you'll also find some like, oh my god, I only have flour and water ways, which also work, you know, great and wonderfully, and you'll get the same kind of bread. But King Arthur flour is a good source for how to use your discard in regular recipes. Like I said earlier, I use it in my pancake batter. I use it for cookies, brownies, English muffins, any kind of cake batter I like to throw it in there for a little bit extra leavening. It just really kind of spruces things up, and I really love that sour flavor. My kids love it too. It just really jazzes up a lot of stuff that may be boring to you, or maybe you just think it needs a little bit extra something. Anybody else? I see more people on here. Awesome. Okay, so I don't know if anybody missed the beginning when I talked about if you don't have instant yeast, or if you don't have active dry yeast, but you can harvest or catch your own yeast. You don't need to start with it. You can just start with flour and water, and you can soak some fruit skins in water. You can soak some raisins, and after a couple of days of leaving that in a warm spot, you'll notice that your water will start to get a little bubbly. That's yeast cultivating. You can use that in your starter in place of just regular water, and that'll, you know, get it going. A couple things I wanted to go over that some people may have missed is instant yeast versus dry yeast. Just a quick pointer. They work the same way. If you are only able to find one in the store, you can use that. One is not better than the other. It's a matter of which one works faster to cultivate that fermentation process. And instant yeast works instantly, like its name. Active dry yeast will work just as well. You'll just have to proof it, which means that you get about a cup of warm water, or however much water your recipe will call for. Make sure it's 90 to 100 degrees. Add the active dry yeast in there, and let it get nice and bubbly and happy, and then you can use it in your recipe to start that leavening process. So if nobody else has questions, I can go over baking bread in this bread machine with your starter, unless anybody else has any questions about starting your starter. Any questions about yeast? I know that's super exciting. Let's see. Does anybody have a starter started already? Nobody does yet, I think. Okay, so I'll show you my bread machine. Oh, you just started yours while talking. Awesome. I want to see some pictures day by day on Facebook. I expect to see some bubbly pictures of your happy starters. Give your starter a name. Ours is Harry. I don't know why my kids named it that, but it's a fun activity to do with your kids. Something I like to do with them before I feed it is have them mark him asleep or her asleep, and then after you feed it, you can see how much it's grown, and that's something really exciting. I see a question from Jackie. If you can read me that question, Bobby.
She asks, how much do you feed each day when you are starting?
So it just depends on how much you want to keep. Some people start their starter with a 1/4 cup of flour, a 1/4 cup of water, and then they don't discard any. They just keep adding until they build up what they like. If you start looking through some recipes right now, you'll notice that a lot of recipes, especially bread recipes, will ask for 3/4 cup to a cup of starter added to your recipe. So when you use your starter, you're not going to be dumping the whole thing and baking bread with that. It's just used as a leavening agent. So you're still going to add flour, you're still going to add sugar, and sometimes you'll add yeast into your recipe for bread. But in addition to all of that stuff, you'll add your leavening agent, which is your starter. And so it's used in place of baking soda, baking powder, basically. The CO2 that's produced from the yeast in here, sorry about that, guys. I think I got interrupted by a call. The CO2 that's produced in here is what's giving your bread or your baking product that oomph. That's what's causing it to rise instead of the baking powder or baking soda. And the alcohol that's produced, because yeast produces two byproducts, CO2 and alcohol, is what's giving it the sour flavor. A good rule of thumb is discard half of your starter every time you feed it and make sure to add an equal amount. So I have about 2 cups, a little over 2 cups in my starter at all times. I discard about a half because that's what I use usually for my recipes. Even if I don't use all of that, I'll still discard it for my starter. And then I want to add another half cup of flour, half cup of water, the equal amount to go in. Otherwise, you're going to have like a gallon of starter at the end because you'll be adding so much flour and water. So you just want to make sure that whatever you discard, you're adding the same amount. So if you wind up with a really huge starter after, the active period dies down and it kind of gets to its normal resting point, if you have like 3 cups, 4 cups, discard some of that. You only really need 2 cups at most because most recipes will only ask for 3/4 to a cup of starter. And each time that you use that, you're going to add more in. So that's a good rule of thumb to keep. Probably no more than 2 cups in your starter at a time. Whatever you take out, you're going to put back in. I hope that answers your question, Jackie. Awesome. Okay. So moving on. If nobody has any other questions, if you do, just post them and then Bobby can jump in and let me know. As far as baking with your starter, I use a bread machine. I have used my oven. You get kind of more of a rustic loaf, I want to say. It's not really sandwich bread. It's more something that you're going to use to put like spreads on. You'll get something that's called a boule, I believe. It's like a bubble bread, and you'll bake it in like a Dutch oven inside your oven. So like a big heavy pot, enamel sealed, cast iron pot is really great to use because it usually heats evenly. You can make sandwich bread in the oven if you don't have a bread maker with a regular loaf. You'll have to put it in a pan that has like a water bath so that it will bake evenly and so that you'll get the correct amount of steam to keep your bread nice and soft. Otherwise, you'll get that really hard crust that a lot of, artisanal loaves have. It's super crunchy on the outside unless it has that steam bath. But I use just a regular bread machine. I believe it's a 2-pound bread machine. It's made by Oster. I bought it on Amazon a couple of years back. But it has a pan inside, and that's what's going to bake your bread. So it looks like this, and inside you'll see it has a little kneading paddle. That's super important. Don't lose it. I've lost mine before. And so what you'll do is you'll add your ingredients into the pan. I use about a cup of my starter along with my flour, sugar, and my instant yeast. So at this point, a lot of recipes that you'll look up, especially King Arthur flour, because they are kind of a fancier flour brand, will ask for a specific type of flour, and they'll ask for bread flour. And so a lot of people, I didn't know the kneading paddle comes off. Yeah, so that's kind of a funny thing. If you pull your bread out, you'll see that there's no kneading paddle, and you'll be like, oh my God, I forgot to put the kneading paddle in. And then you'll remember that it comes with this fancy hook with a little knot at the end, and that's to pull the paddle out of the bread, because your loaf will almost always have the paddle stuck inside the bread after it comes out of the pan. And even to this day, I'll pull my bread out and think, oh my gosh, I forgot to put the kneading paddle in. How did I get this wonderful bread? Well, the kneading paddle is inside the bread and you got to pull it out. So that's a fun thing to remember. So back to the flour, you'll notice that a lot of recipes will call for a specific type of flour, and it's good to follow that recommendation, but you don't always have to do it. The reason that it calls for bread flour a lot of time is because bread flour has a higher gluten content meaning that your bread will come out more bready. It won't be so dry. It'll be super moist. But the good thing about using a sourdough starter, if you have all-purpose flour only, is it will add a little bit extra moisture, especially if you have 100% hydration, which you'll see come up in a lot of recipes. And that will sound a little weird. You're like, what's 100% hydration? I don't even know what this starter is. I'll explain it to you. 100% hydration means that you have a 1-to-1 ratio of flour and water in your starter. And since we're basically starting with that already, it's going to produce a really wet starter versus something that's really doughy. And so you'll notice when you pull it out, which I'll show you mine, it's pretty gloppy and it's kind of hard to manage. So I'm mixing up mine because I had a bunch of bubbles in liquid, but it's pretty pancake battery. See? And so that's what is going to give your bread some really great rise. But it's also really hydrated, which means that has a lot of water content, and that's really good for baking sandwich bread because you know, you want that moistness. You don't want your bread to be super dry. But it doesn't really matter if you use bread flour or all-purpose flour with the sourdough starter, because that hydration, that 100% hydration, is going to keep it moist enough, and it's going to keep it bready enough. You don't need to worry about the extra gluten content that bread flour has. The only word of warning I'm going to give is using whole wheat flour. Now, I use whole wheat flour in moderation, meaning I don't try to make my bread 100% whole wheat. I do use whole wheat in my starter, which is why you'll see it's kind of speckled. And I just do that for flavor and for texture. I do have whole wheat flour, and you'll notice that when you bake with it, if you're not an experienced baker, your bread will come out really dry. And I think most of that has to do with trial and error. I've done a lot of research about it, and I can't really figure out why my bread comes out so dry other than it just being whole wheat flour. But it does give it a good flavor, and I would say once you start baking loaves, maybe cut half of your recipe, half all-purpose flour or bread flour and half whole wheat, because it does give it a really good flavor. Or even substitute, you know, like a quarter of your flour measurement for whole wheat, because it does come out really yummy. But a lot of recipes for bread will ask for you to add yeast in addition to your starter. And so you don't have to be afraid of that if you don't have yeast. What you can do is the same process you did for starting your starter without yeast, is to soak fruit in water and get some yeasty water going. So whatever quantity your recipe calls for, if it's like a quarter cup or half a cup, make it warm water, something that's comfortable to put your hand under, 90 to 100 degrees. Soak some raisins, soak some fruit a couple days on your counter, and use that in place of your water measurement for your recipe. It will have, you know, a pretty good amount of yeast in it, and that will help you, if you don't have any yeast from the store, get that extra added rise from your loaf. Does anybody have any questions at this point? That's a lot of stuff I just went over. I'll pause to see. I see some people in their kitchens mixing up stuff. Awesome. Sound good? You see anything, Bobby? Nothing? Okay. That's about it for my starter. I can mix up stuff and show you how I make my bread if you like in my bread machine, or I can let you guys have at it and see if you want to try some other recipes. Everything that I posted on the Pinterest board is to utilize your discard from your starter on a daily basis if you like, or even you can save it for when you're only feeding once a week and discarding once a week. You can just throw it in your pancakes, whatever you want to do. One other really cool thing I want to say about your starter is, if you're not using your discard in the beginning and you don't want to waste it, you can pull out your discard when you feed it and put it in a Ziploc bag and give it to somebody else. That's known as Amish friendship bread. And that's basically a starter for them, their own starter. And they can feed it and cultivate it, continuing on from what you did. And some people will even freeze that starter in their freezer and pull it out at a later date and set that bag in some warm water and notice that the yeast will come back to life. If your starter goes bad, that's a good backup to have. You can have like a gazillion tiny starters in your freezer, or you can pass them out to neighbors or friends who are also trying to start bread and don't have yeast, because then they will also have their own yeasty starter going, and all they have to do is add flour and water. So that's a fun thing to do. Any other questions? Anybody got their starter going?
What are some of your favorite ways to use your starter? Like only in breads, pizza crust? What's your favorite recipes?
Yeah, so the thing we make the most is cinnamon raisin bread, sandwich bread, which I do a half and half whole wheat and all-purpose flour or bread flour sandwich bread loaf in my machine. A really cool thing about these bread machines is they give you time to fix any mistakes or add anything you forgot. They're very forgiving for starting bakers. You basically throw everything into this pan, meaning all your ingredients. Even if you don't have a starter and you're just using regular yeast because either your starter went bad or for whatever reason you don't feel like doing it, you can throw all those ingredients into your pan, and you don't even need to proof your yeast. You can just put your warm water and your yeast on top and put that in your bread machine, and it will keep it warm in the beginning stages. It will proof it, it will knead it for you, and everything will come out super great in the end, even though you put in absolutely no effort other than just adding the ingredients in. So I love baking cinnamon bread and just regular sourdough bread or whole wheat sourdough bread. There is a moment in my bread machine after the initial phase of my original white bread ingredients or sourdough bread ingredients where it will beep. That's usually about 15 minutes into the process, I believe. And just to let you know, the process is about 4 hours, 3 to 4 hours baking in your bread machine. So just keep that in mind. It's not like an hour. And the process to bake in your oven is like a 2-day ordeal. You really do have to let your bread proof. You have to let it rise. There is a series of pulling and folding, kneading for your bread. That's Knead, not like kneady bread, even though it is kneady. There is a lot of that going on. So just keep in mind, if you feel like doing it the old-fashioned way and you don't have a bread machine, your bread will have to be worked to work up that gluten product so that you get, you know, not like a wimpy bread that doesn't rise. You got to keep it happy. You got to keep it going. But your bread machine will beep about 15 minutes into the process, and that is your cue to put all of your add-ins in. So I will add cinnamon butter, brown sugar. Some people add molasses, honey, raisins, any kind of apricot or fruit. And this is on just the normal white bread. It's like the first option basic bread is what they call it. And it's just throw your ingredients in, and then 15 minutes later add whatever extra add-ins that you want, and the machine will knead them in, and it will come out wonderful. So we do that about once a week, sandwich bread and cinnamon raisin bread. We also make pizza dough. I have a stand KitchenAid mixer with a kneading hook, and what I will do is I use the King Arthur flour pizza dough recipe using my sourdough starter, and I knead that recipe in my standing KitchenAid mixer for about 7 minutes until the dough ball will wrap itself around the hook and clean the side of my bowl, meaning There won't be any sticky remnants left from the dough. It will be completely clean, and the dough ball will actually be like clinging onto the hook. That's when I know that the dough is ready. And then I set it into a bowl that's well greased with some olive oil, and I put it in my oven. Sometimes I'll turn my oven on really low for like 3 minutes and shut it off just so it's a nice warm area. And then I let it proof for about 2 to 4 hours. That's something I'll do sometimes in the morning, and I'll forget all about it, and I'll come back about 5 in the evening and it will be perfectly risen. At that point that the dough is nice and fluffy, you're going to punch it back down, shape it into the form that you want, and you can either let it rise so it gets nice. Is anyone's stomach growling? Mine is growling just talking about it. I'm like, I should make pizza tonight. But yeah, you can shape it into whatever form you want, leave it in a nice warm area until the dough rises however thick you like your crust, and you can pop it in the oven. That recipe is on my Pinterest board. It's also on the King Arthur Flour website. Theirs is pretty foolproof. Like I said, people have tested all of their recipes extensively, and there's also little tidbits of information like, did your dough not rise? Maybe you should have done this, or you could do this, and it will tell you like troubleshooting points that I have referred to millions of times. But that pizza crust or pizza dough recipe is awesome. You can even whip it up, put it in a Ziploc bag, keep it in your fridge, pull it out, let it heat up, and do the proofing or the raising period somewhere down the line. You can double the recipe and it comes out great. You can freeze it, wake it up a little bit later by putting it in some warm water. That works just as fine. I have dumped my sourdough starter into some brownies. They came out great. For some reason, chocolate with that sourdough flavor is amazing. I don't know what it does. It's like the Japanese umami thing. It gives it like a little bit extra flavor that you can't get from anything else. It is so good. Chocolate chip cookies, I have used my starter in, and so when I say in place of, I mean I usually leave out like the baking soda part, because sometimes when you bake with baking soda, it can give things a little like metallic or weird bitter flavor, and so I will use the starter in place of that. I'll still add in baking powder, but the baking soda I try to leave out a lot of times because it does give stuff a funky flavor, especially if it's not mixed in well or incorporated well. It's also just a healthier thing to use in place of that. Sourdough starter has all this great bacteria for your gut, and it just, I think it makes things yummier. But yeah, chocolate chip cookies, I dump it in my pancake batter. So what I will do is use the Krusteaz instant pancake batter, mix it with water, add about a half a cup to my batter, and then just go from there. And I don't need to substitute or change anything. I just add it to it. And I noticed that the pancakes come out a bit fluffier. They just have like a really good flavor that's just so good. There is a pancake recipe from scratch, I believe, on my Pinterest board. If you don't have Krusteaz or Bisquick mix, you can use sourdough starter and just regular flour and sugar and other ingredients you might have in your pantry, and that will also give you really good rise if you don't have that already instant compound like Bisquick or Krusteaz. Let's see, what else? Crumpets. If we don't really make crumpets in the United States a lot, it's kind of a British or Australian thing. But a lot of British people or people in other parts of the world make crumpets in place of pancakes, and they're really delicious. And they just kind of, it's basically like a sourdough bread pancake. I like to use them like in place of toast and put like butter and jam on them. They're so good. And they're just like pancake sourdough bread bites. They're so good. You can make them on a griddle, just like you make pancakes, and they're very bubbly and very crunchy and soft on the inside. They're so good. English muffins are kind of an adventure. I have made them before, but they require like a 2-step process sometimes. You want to get that like really brown layer on your skillet, and then you can make them also. I have made donuts with them before, which came out really good. If you have a donut mold, if you don't, you can shape them and fry them up in your pot. They're still really good. Let's see, what else have I used? I think that's about it. Any kind of batter that I have for cupcakes or muffins. A lot of times we're making muffins these mornings. We make those instant muffins from Betty Crocker all the time, and they're a little not exciting. My kids are like, ugh, when I make them. But if I throw in, 3/4 cup of my starter, they're like phenomenal. They totally explode out of my muffin tin, and they just totally, it's like Popeye eating his spinach. They just really beef them up, and they're super good. But yeah, I would recommend next time you have an instant packet of anything, throw a little bit of your starter in there, and it's going to taste really, really good. Anybody have any other questions? Bobby, did you get anything else in the chat room? And I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, but just in case people join late, there are a million ways to start your starter. Oh, Jackie, yours is already growing. That means it's super happy. Yeah. So a lot of times you'll see within like the first couple minutes, it will just totally grow. And my kids literally stood and watched ours grow, and they were marking it like every 5 minutes with a marker to see how high it could get. But yeah. Sorry, I totally lost my thought. Went off on that tangent. Anybody remember what I was talking about? I think I was touching back on, different varieties of your starter. So a lot of you will go on Pinterest after this. I really recommend that you go on Pinterest and look up starters and starter recipes, because there is a billion recipes and tips for maintaining your starter or starting your starter. And if this one doesn't work well for you, go look on there and see what other people are doing, because there's just like 101 million ways to make a starter, and they all work great because people are obviously baking bread from them. So try them out. Look at how other people feed their starter. Maybe that will work better for you. And if you see, I talked about this earlier, which if you came late, I talked a little bit about troubleshooting your starter and the science behind your starter. But if you don't maintain good feeding habits, your starter can go bad. And a couple things to look for is mold. And usually it will appear around the rim of your starter. It won't look like regular mold. It will just look gross and green and brown maybe, but you'll notice it will have a bad smell. And the top layer of your starter will have a lot of that hooch, that alcohol byproduct from your yeast. And if you have a lot of that alcohol byproduct or that liquid anywhere in your starter, don't freak out. It just means that your starter wants to eat more. It's more active. You can feed it twice a day if it's on the counter before you put it in the fridge. So if you're worried at any point and you think that your starter is going to go bad because it has a lot of that liquid, maybe you can feed it morning and night. You can also cut back on that hydration, meaning you can incorporate maybe a 1/2 cup of flour and a 1/4 cup of water. Lowering your hydration rate may change a little bit of stuff when you use it in your recipes later on. It will only mean you have to add more water into your recipe when you add that sourdough starter into it. But I notice a lot of times that my starter has been angry and it throws off a lot of that hooch or alcohol. I cut back on the hydration, and that will keep my yeast not so active, and it won't throw out a lot of that alcohol or liquid. But I always mix it back in as long as you're maintaining your feeding schedule, which is the first, couple of days before you get it to that fermentation level that you like. Feed it at least once a day. If it gets too crazy, you can up it to twice a day. Just make sure you're discarding at least half of it. And after about, I would say no more than 10 days, put it in your fridge so that it starts to be more dormant. You only have to feed it once a week. And if you forget to feed it, by a couple of days every week, don't freak out. chances are you'll just have a little bit more liquid, and you'll have to remember to feed it on time next time. Any other questions? Anybody? I see Jackie. Awesome. Sound good?
Yes. Can we have your phone number, and in case something goes wrong?
Yeah.
This is a big deal, Charlotte.
You can call me, definitely. You can call me or text me, or you can message me on Facebook. I will be here at home working on bread stuff, probably. But baking, I want to say right now, especially, people are like, I'm going to have bread coming out of my ears. What do I do with this? Especially once you start getting your discard going. I would say make sure you share those discards with friends or neighbors. Worst case scenario, they're just going to throw it away. I bake bread for my dad and my aunt right now so that they don't have to go out to the grocery store as much. I will whip up some pancake batter for them and put it in a Ziploc bag and send it in a care package for them to pick up, just to kind of lower their chances of having, dangerous situations outside. So, if you don't have anything to do with your discard, give it away. Make something, prepare something for your friend or neighbor, even if it's just like a batch of cookies, because this stuff will grow and it will multiply and it will cultivate until you are panicking that you don't know what to do with it. So if you don't know what to do with your discard, even if it is in those first couple of days that you're discarding, and you don't want to waste it, because flour is really a precious thing right now. I couldn't find it anywhere. About 3 weeks ago, I had to go to Costco and buy a 25-pound bag. And so I have a 25-pound bag of flour sitting in my pantry, and I just make this starter for all my neighbors, and I bake bread for everybody that I know. So utilize it if you can. And these first couple of days of discard, if you feel a certain amount of guilt throwing it away, put it in a baggie and give it to a friend. Amish starter bread with some basic instructions for them to feed it every day. Or my phone number so that they can call me and ask me what to do. Anybody else? Any questions?
Jackie?
I feel like
Go ahead.
this is going to be an I Love Lucy moment where it's going to explode.
I have a friend who put their starter in a container kind of like this size, and she followed my same recipe that I use with the cup of flour, cup of water, and she wanted to catch her own yeast, and she put it on her counter, and she sent me a picture, and it was like all over. It was total I Love Lucy. It was just like spewing out from every corner, all on her countertop, and she was like, it's alive. She was like, oh my God, it's alive. She didn't know what to do. But yeah, it gets very active. That's why for anybody who started late, make sure you have a big enough vessel. It can be any container as long as it's not metal. Any utensil you use to stir it with, make sure it's not metal. Whatever chemical reaction is going on with the yeast, the metal will kind of cancel that out, I guess. It has a negative reaction with the chemistry going on inside your starter. So if you've already used metal, no big deal. It might just make things go slower. You might notice nothing happens at all, but try to use plastic. Try to use a glass or plastic container, or even a plastic baggie works. Yeah, that works great. But yeah, big container, almost double the size of what you're working with, because I haven't fed this guy for, I don't know, a couple days, maybe a day, and he's already like bubbly and growing. And I keep him in the fridge. And now that he's been out of the fridge for a while, he's pretty bubbly and happy. He's like, I'm awake. What are we going to bake now? Put me in something. So watch out. It will grow. Be prepared for that. And if it does spill out, just save what you have and throw away the rest. So no big deal. But it is fun to watch. It's fun for kids to see. And even when I look at it and I mix it up, I'm like, those are some pretty big bubbles. Well done there, Harry. So anybody else want to share that, what's going on with their yeast if you're mixing it right now? I can see a few of you, I think. Anybody? No.
Jackie said she's going to need a bigger bowl, and Heather
Yeah.
said the same thing.
Yeah. So the most active period is right now. That yeast is like super brand new. He was just born. He's eating everything in there. And you'll notice it will mellow out once that fermentation starts going. You really have to train your starter to chill out a little bit. You know, once you only feed it, I feed mine once a week, and it doesn't really grow more than, 1 or 2 inches now. But in the beginning, it was doubling in size. And so, my container, I put a coffee filter on it because I would have to throw this away every time because it would be like pushing up out of my container. So, and if it does get too big, you don't want to have like a gallon of starter, you can discard more and only add a smaller amount, or you can give some away. Just make sure you're feeding it when you take some out. And the reason for that discard is so that you're putting in fresh food for your starter every time. It's not just like stagnant, ingredients in there. It's really, making it fresh and new every time. The yeast that is also constantly going in there because you're putting a breathable lid on it. Make sure you don't close your lid airtight. You want to make sure there's air coming in and out. And the reason for that is because this organism needs to breathe, is living. And also because you'll still have wild yeast going in there. And on like a hotter day when it's not so rainy, this will be super active, especially on your countertop. Warmness will make it come alive and grow. Coldness will kind of keep it nice and dormant if that's what you're looking for. But that's exciting. Anybody else? Anything?
I think everybody said thank you. Linda said thank you, Chloe, Jackie.
Thank you guys for joining. I'm excited. I want to see some posts. Tag me or send me a message. I just want to see how it goes for you guys. And I'm excited to see how you use it because I am constantly looking for new ways to use this to make our diet more healthy and also just to get rid of it because, I got to discard it every week. But yeah, let me know, share. If you have problems, message me. If you have any more questions or you need repeated information, also recommend looking on Pinterest or at King Arthur Flour website. There is a ton of information out there. There's a ton of fails on Facebook, sourdough fails. What people post that are hilarious and great and also give me a little bit of validation about problems I've had in the past. So yeah, don't feel bad. Don't be discouraged if it doesn't go well or if you forget to feed it. Just do a little bit more research and see what other people are doing. Sound good, Bobby?
You did fantastic.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Yay, our first training is done. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Everybody for listening. Share all your good knowledge and information with everybody else.